Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific. I'm Jerry Schubel, president of the Aquarium, and it's great to have all of you with us tonight for this lecture. We'd love to have you in person, but you're better off being at home and being safe. We hope we'll have you back here with us in person sometime soon. I want to thank our lecture sponsors, Gazette Newspapers, and the Courtyard Marriott. Tonight, it's a real pleasure to welcome an old friend and colleague, Dr. Charles Colgan, and he's going to discuss the blue economy. Dr. Colgan is the Director of Research for the Center for the Blue Economy at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. He's also Professor Emeritus of Public Policy and Planning at the University of Southern Maine in the Muskie School of Public Policy. And at one point, he chaired that program. At the Center for the Blue Economy, Dr. Colgan conducts studies connecting economic and environmental forces shaping human uses of the oceans and looking at the economic dimensions of sea level rise adaptation. The Center for the Blue Economy studies are conducted in California, around the US, and indeed around the world. Charlie received his BA from Colby College in Maine and his PhD from the University of Maine. Prior to joining the University of Southern Maine, he worked in the Maine Planning Department, and for 14 years, he was a key consultant to the National Ocean Economics Program, which I think you see the cover of one of their reports on the screen. That program created the field of coastal and ocean economics, and it provided much of the methodology that's now used around the world. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Ocean and Coastal Economics. He's a prolific contributor to the ways in which the ocean can serve society without compromising ocean ecosystems. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Colgan. Charlie?
Thank you, Jerry, and good evening, everyone. So I'm socially distancing from you tonight, not only over Zoom, but I'm also at my home in South Portland, Maine, where the situation is a little different than it is in California. I miss being out in California, but not these days. I want to talk tonight about this concept called the blue economy. It's a term that is widely used around the world. I think that you can go to all parts of the globe and find people who are talking about the blue economy in one way or another. Probably the only place where there's not a lot of discussion, frankly, in the ocean community is here in the US, and that's for a variety of reasons, some of which are probably pretty obvious. But it is an idea that has taken hold at the highest policy levels in the world among not only governments but international organizations like the World Bank, the United Nations, and others. And so I want to explore the concept today, and that in that exploration we'll see different definitions of and different ideas about what the blue economy is, and also see something about how those ideas are translated into fairly concrete steps to understand the economics of the oceans and to help make decisions. Whether the blue economy as an idea maintains a focus of attention and really drives the debate about the future uses of the ocean in more economically productive and ecologically sustainable ways is a matter on which the jury is still out, as we're still in the early phases of this idea disseminating through which the world, and it's unfortunately disseminating a lot slower than the coronavirus. But we hope that the discussion tonight and through the following years does succeed in making it a concept that more people are paying attention to. Are the covers of just some of the studies, some of which we've been involved with, the ones in the Caribbean and in Bangladesh, and the NOEP study you see on the left-hand side. Those are all ones that our center and I was involved with. We're working in Africa right now, in Kenya and Tanzania, to implement some of the ideas in the Africa Blue Economy Policy Handbook, and working with the World Bank and the UN in a number of projects to bring these ideas not only from the attention of policymakers and national governments, but down to the real day-to-day decision-making that's going to be necessary in order for this to have an effect. I'm going to, at this point, propose that there are three different aspects to the blue economy. And I want to emphasize here that they are different focuses. They are different ways of thinking about it. And some places are emphasizing one more than another, but they all fit together at the end of the day. The first idea is the ocean economy, the National Ocean Economics Program, and the data that we developed under that is a big part of that. What does the ocean contribute to national and regional economic activity? We've just come out with some new measures of the U.S. ocean economy, and you guys are going to be among the first to see the results of that. The second idea is this sustainable ocean economy, the integration of ecological and economic systems into a single perspective on the ocean that takes account both of human uses and of ecological processes. And the third element is the field of what's called blue technology. This is a very amorphous and ill-defined area, but it is the way in which a lot of governments, particularly in Europe, the US, Canada, and other places, think about the blue economy in terms of the opportunities to drive technological innovation and thus economic activity. And I'm going to explore each of these in turn to talk about how each of them manifests itself in different ways. These are just examples. There are lots of different ways and different ways that the different countries look at the problem, but I'll try to illustrate them as we go along. The concept here is of an integrated perspective between the different parts of the idea of the blue economy. At the core is this concept of the ocean economy, or the ocean gross domestic product, which is the share of the output of goods and services in a given region. It might be a country, it might be a state, it might be a county, that is attributed to or related to ocean-related activities. In addition to that kind of core understanding of the ocean as a contributor, there is also what are called the ocean economic and environmental perspectives. The ocean and economic environmental accounts, which take into account physical inputs to the economy. For example, we don't just look at the value of fish landings, we want to look at the value of the stock of fish, the value of the biomass, and how that changes as the ecology and as humans change their uses of fisheries. How does that change the value of the stocks, of the physical inputs like fish or minerals? But we also want to take account of the fact that our uses of the ocean unfortunately have the side effect of putting a lot of byproducts of our land-based and ocean-based activities back into the ocean as wastes, and we need to account for those as well. And finally, there is this larger picture that we're just now beginning to fully understand, which is called ecosystem services. The idea is that the ecological characteristics of the ocean and marine systems provide specific services to people which are of value, and we're trying to measure the extent of that value and the way in which it changes with human activities. And there are different kinds of ecosystem services about which I'll speak a little bit later, include what are called regulating, cultural, and provisioning services. So this picture here gives you a kind of general overview of the relationship among the first of the two boxes. And lying behind that is all of the technology and what I will call the foundations of the digital ocean, that are necessary to fully integrate our understanding of ecological and economic processes. So this is kind of a graphic picture of the way in which those three elements or perspectives on the blue economy can be seen. I want to talk first about the ocean economy of the United States. Over the last 4 years, we've been involved with NOAA and the Bureau of Economic Analysis in creating a comprehensive picture of the role of the oceans and Great Lakes. I want to make sure that we nod to the fact that the Great Lakes are included in the ocean economy of the U.S. This is work that is the second generation of the data that I developed for the National Ocean Economics Program, which was the first generation of ocean economic statistics. The first time that anybody was able to put together a series of measurements of ocean economic activity that was both consistent across time and consistent from the county level through to the national level. That approach had a lot of advantages, particularly with its ability to see down to the county level. But we know that I knew from the beginning that it had a lot of limitations. People have asked me over the years since I started doing that work about 20 years ago now, where do you know where the weaknesses of this data are? And I said, oh yeah, I know where all the berries are buried because I buried them. And so this new generation of called the Ocean Economic or the Prototype Ocean Economic Statistics, which was just released a month ago, and that we've been working on with the federal government for 4 years, expands that idea of ocean economic activity to take account of, in much more accurate ways, the role of the oceans, and also includes a lot of ocean economic activity that has previously not been included. We've expanded the definition. We still haven't got it quite right. There's years of work ahead to refine the definitions and improve the estimates. We have relied almost entirely on existing government data systems, which are at the moment sort of okay suited for doing this kind of work, but could be made to work much better. This represents the value added of the ocean economy in 2018. We've estimated for 5 years, from 2014 to 2018, at about $358 million. This is roughly consistent with what we estimated in the NOEP data, but it's a little bit higher. This shows you the distribution by percentage of the ocean-related economic activity in the U.S. economy, and the percentage made up of each of the major sectors. Now, in this particular graphic, and in the one I'm going to show you in a minute, the definitions are by the standard industry definitions. These are the definitions you would find in any government statistics. I'll show you a little bit later the data for specific ocean-related economic activities or industries that go to make up this data. Just quickly, this is the ocean economy distribution, and this is the U.S. economy as a whole. And you'll notice some big differences. So one of the big differences is that big thing over on the left, which is government. Almost all of that, essentially 70 billion out of about $78 billion is the Navy, is national defense. And the U.S. has a unique situation when including the Navy and the government in its statistics, as almost all other countries do. But our Navy is different because it is one of the only, if not the only, Navy with a complete worldwide presence. You all know the Navy in San Diego or in other major locations of the U.S., but the Navy operates around the world 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year round. And it operates at a scale that no other country comes close to matching. And so our economic statistics are a little distorted by the fact that our Navy is such a large enterprise within the ocean economy. Mining, basically oil and gas, is about 9%. Transportation at about 10%. Notice down there 15% of finance, insurance, and real estate. So that is mostly the activities of real estate and real estate renting connected to oceanfront, near oceanfront or near ocean real estate activities. Take the Navy out, and property is the largest contributor to the ocean economy, or property-related services. And that has profound impacts, if you think about it, for climate change and sea level rise going forward. 10% of the ocean economy is arts, recreation, accommodation, food service, basically tourism and recreation. Everything else is relatively small. You can take arts, recreation, and accommodation and add that to retail trade, and that's about the tourism and recreation sector. Manufacturing is primarily ship and boat building. Primarily, most of that is shipbuilding for the Navy. And so it's a reminder again how important the government is in this sector. So that's the ocean economy. This is the US economy. You can see that finance, insurance, and real estate is still a large portion of that. In this case, it's not real estate. In this case, it's finance, banking, insurance, and so on. Education, health, and social assistance, very large in the US economy, much smaller in the almost below 1% in the US, in the ocean economy, not surprisingly. Manufacturing much bigger in the US. The ocean economy is somewhat smaller because it's so specialized, primarily in ships and boats. But there are a lot of other things that are manufactured related to the ocean. But in terms of dollar value, the the biggest dollar values are in ships and boats. This is employment. The previous graph I just showed you. So this is the picture with respect to the value of output. This is the picture with respect to employment. The government, again, the Navy employs a lot of people, both civilian and military personnel. Transportation, arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food services are a lot of people. Transportation tends to employ more full-time people, which is why in the way that this employment data is calculated, it tends to show up with a higher number. You can see mining at 3.6% of employment, 9% of output. That reflects the capital-intensive nature of the oil and gas industry. There's a lot more detail into this, but we can look. This is one spin on the ocean economy data. As I say, this is the standard definition of industries. But we also looked at the definition of the ocean economy using specific ocean-related activities. And these are actually built from the NOEP or ENOW data that we developed earlier. So looking at value added in 2018, the largest sector of value added by ocean-related activities is tourism and recreation. And second is government. And that's not surprising because tourism and recreation is very big. Not so much this summer. It's quiet. It's a quiet summer here in Maine, even though the virus situation is rather different than in California. It's still a very quiet summer here in Maine. But that's a major part of the ocean economy. Second is minerals. Minerals in this case has been much more precisely defined than in previous data. So we're now down to much more focused on exactly what's coming out of the ocean as opposed to some rather crude estimates we made earlier. A couple of areas that are new in the calculations: marine research and education. You got the Aquarium in the Pacific is in there in marine research and education. Ship and boat building is 2.5% of the output. We've added in utilities. And in this measure, we've looked at coastal shoreline, essentially shoreline utilities generating electric power. There's virtually no renewable electric generation now in the U.S. currently, except for one small project off Block Island in Rhode Island. But when we did this in 2018, that wasn't even operating. So right now, it's the kind of old standby of fossil fuel and in a couple of cases nuclear plants that are using the shoreline location for cooling waters. Living resources, 3.4% of value added. That's aquaculture and fisheries. The U.S. is among the smaller percentages in terms of living resources in its overall ocean economy. Not surprising because the government's so large. But the fishing industry, as you know, and it's pretty stable right now, but it's still relatively small because we import between 80 and 90% of the fish that we eat. Our domestic supply is very small, and that's reflected in the relatively small portion that is living resources. So that's a picture of the center of my sort of bullseye diagram, the ocean economy of the U.S. And now let's look at the second and third parts of that, which are the relationship between the economy and the ecosystem. This is one of dozens of similar infographics that I've found talking about ocean ecosystems. So it happens to come from New Zealand, but it could just as easily apply almost anywhere. And of course, it's designed to just very briefly illustrate the rich density of different kinds of life forms, the different parts of the ocean, the deep ocean, the coastal ocean, the relationship between land and ocean. They've got commercial fishing up here, but it could have been, could just as easily have been a container ship or, well, once upon a time, a cruise ship. What we're trying to do in the studying the ecological relationship between the ocean and coast is to simultaneously understand how these interact. So on the one hand, we're trying to understand ecosystems, ecosystem conditions, and the potential to provide goods and services that flow over to the socioeconomic systems. The socioeconomic systems use those ecosystem services, but they also, to the benefit of people, but they also, in a lot of ways, of course, the economic systems flow backwards and change the ecosystems. Pollution, climate change, fishing is both an ecosystem flow along the bottom line and a driver of change along the top line. And trying to understand these things together is a real challenge. We're really just beginning to understand how to do that and to build the capacity that we'll need to see this sustainable blue economy as a dynamic and measurable set of phenomena. I talked about ecosystem services. There is something called CITES, the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services. A lot of what I'm talking about here is not unique to the US. A lot of what I'm talking about here is, in fact, already well accepted and well understood basis for international standards. The work that I just showed you on our ocean economic statistics is now, that approach is now incorporated into the technical guidance for the UN ocean accounting system. That technical guidance, which will be used by countries around the world, so we're essentially trying to standardize all of these different approaches to the extent that we can. And so we have this common international classification. Provisioning ecosystems include nutrition, materials, energy, and that yields biomass, fiber, water, and so on. regulation and maintenance, mediation of waste, mediation of flows. Mediation of flows is the term that applies to an important element in a lot of the ecosystem work that we do, which is about flood control, wave attenuation, and reduction in flood hazards connected to sea level rise. There's also things like the maintenance of physical, chemical, and biological conditions, one of which is soil formation and composition. Soil composition, one of the big areas that's being studied there is what's called blue carbon, which is the potential for coastal wetlands and other types of wetlands to sequester carbon as part of overall strategies to mitigate climate change. And finally, there are cultural definitions, cultural types of ecosystem services. Physical and experiential interactions include things like recreation, day at the beach, down at the surfing, spiritual, symbolic, and other interactions with ecosystems and landscapes. So as an example of that, in Puget Sound, we're currently doing an ecosystem service assessment of a wetland restoration on the Stillaguamish River on the eastern shore of Puget Sound. One of the big purposes of that is to measure is to restore salmon habitat. And the salmon habitat, in this case, the measures of benefits that we're using are tied to the spiritual values of the Stillaguamish tribe, which actually owns the river and the salmon. And we're not putting monetary values on it, but we're actually interviewing tribal members to try and understand how the presence of salmon and the abundance of salmon affects their lives as members of a Native American tribe. So it's not just a matter of putting dollars on everything, it's a matter of understanding the value of things in the way that people themselves want to see those values. The biggest challenge that we have in the sustainable blue economy types of measures, the conjoining of the physical, biological, and socioeconomic systems, it's where to get the data. Some of the data is not too hard, but a lot of the data is very difficult. People are not doing studies of the ocean economy or they're not connecting those studies to the ecological systems, or they're doing detailed studies of the ecological systems without necessarily understanding anything about the economic aspects of what they're doing. And so we've kind of got two very large trains or two very large ships sailing on parallel courses. And occasionally the two ships communicate with one another with, at this point, I'd say we're back in the signal flag era, where hoist of signal flags is the only way the two ships could communicate with each other. So we're still pretty primitive. We have really great ships, but that communication between the two is still a major challenge. So we can get a lot of these physical and biological and economic changes through a variety of means, purpose-built studies, ocean observing systems, about which more I'll talk more in a minute, indicator series, the Ocean Health Index. There are a lot of kind of just physical change indicator series. And then finally, there are a lot of studies of monitoring, but I'll give you an example. Everybody pays money to do the economics of, for example, deciding whether to do a wetland restoration or not. Nobody pays, except in this one case, literally this one case in the US that we're doing up in Puget Sound, where they're actually paying us to set up a monitoring system, because it will take decades for that wetland restoration to settle in to a new ecology and a new economic set of relationships. And right now, there isn't anything in place to monitor those things over time. But we need all four of these and other types of studies in order to build the data that allows us to do the analysis of the interactions. I want to talk in this case about another project that we're doing that expresses these principles and tries to adapt them to a particular situation. This is another project that literally has just been finished within the last couple of weeks. We've been working on it for 2 years now. It involves a site in California called Elkhorn Slough, which is in Monterey County. It's about 18 miles north of Monterey. Many of you may have been to Elkhorn Slough or Moss Landing, which is the settlement that is the nearby location, site of the big power plant on Monterey Bay. Anybody who's been to Monterey Bay, you've seen those two big power plant stacks. That's an inactive oil-fired power plant, been active for 20 years or more. That's Moss Landing. It's not in this picture. That power plant is just off to your right in this picture. What you see there is Highway 1. In this neck of California, it's known as the Cabrillo Highway, not the Pacific Coast Highway, for reasons that are still obscure to me as a New Englander. And you can see that Elkhorn Slough, which is the largest estuary in California outside of San Francisco Bay, is at an interesting place. It's right at the crossroads between the dense ecosystems and the marsh ecosystems in the slough. Those areas off to the left are recovering salt ponds. Sea salt was once the major industry here. And Highway 1 crosses it there, but you'll notice if you look off to the left that Highway 1 is at grade. In fact, even today, it's subject to flooding at king tide. If you put 1, 2, 2.5, 3 feet of sea level rise on top of that, Highway 1 basically becomes a lake at about 2 feet of sea level rise. Highway 1 shuts down pretty much on every high tide. So what do we do about this? So that's been the subject of the study that we've been doing, and we've been trying to, in cooperation with our collaborators, the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, the consulting firm ESA, and the Nature Conservancy, we're trying to figure out a strategy that not only deals with the transportation problem, but also deals with the ecological problem of maintaining and preserving as much of the ecosystem services associated with Elkhorn Slough as we can. This is a very complicated study. I can only hit a few of the highlights, but basically after a number of years, we came down and looked at a couple of different options, looked at a couple of different problems. Obviously, one is flooding. The flooding affects not only the highway, it also affects the rail line, which runs the principal rail line owned by the Union Pacific, which not only serves freight in the area, but is also one of the principal rail lines running up and down the California coast. The Amtrak train that runs from LA to Seattle runs through that, in that picture right there. That's the rail line at a high tide. That rail line is essentially shut down now 2 or 3 times a year because of high tide. And then there's the loss of potential habitat and degradation due to the reductions, the increases in flooding. We came up with a couple of different options. One was to keep the existing transportation systems, the rail line and the highway, and basically elevate them. And we could either elevate them on piles, as you see in the bottom of this, or on fill. And we looked at doing that. We also looked at basically doing what's called an ecotone, which is a much wider and essentially a restored type or constructed type of wetland that extends on either side of the transportation infrastructure. On the top here, you can see this habitat fill slope, and that represents the width of the constructed ecosystem that we would put in place. Another option here, you see Highway 1 on the left. Another option we looked at was diverting all the traffic up into what's called San Miguel Canyon Road or County T12, basically shutting down Route 1 as a through highway and diverting everyone 8 miles up into the mountains, and then having them rejoin Highway 1 to the north when the elevation is high enough that it's not going to be affected by sea level rise. So we have a couple of different options there. And I should say that a big part of this, as you'll see in a minute, is that the current 2-lane highway is inadequate to handle the traffic, and there's already significant traffic delays. If in this analysis, we, in this case, our colleagues at ESA, did an analysis of how the wetlands would change if we took no action. And so if we did that, the vast majority of the change would be 2,900, almost 3,000 additional acres by 2100 of salt water, a loss of 700 acres of agricultural land, a loss of 1,300 acres of salt marsh, 400 acres of tidal flats, or about 1,750 or so acres of productive coastal habitat would be lost if we took no action, and most of Elkhorn Slough would become just open water. We then calculated the changes under each of the scenarios. That right-hand side just shows you the changes in acreage, and we then put some economic values on those. Another part of this is recreation. Elkhorn Slough attracts somewhere around 45,000 people a year for recreation, primarily for water recreation. A large part is school groups, and another large part are bird watchers. Elkhorn Slough is a major stopover on the flyway. So recreation is a big part of this. And last year, we did a survey of about 400 recreationists on the water side in Moss Landing to not only learn about their recreation patterns, but also estimate the value of their recreational experience, and in particular, the value that they found in encountering and being able to see up close sea otters, which are, of course, throughout Elkhorn Slough as a result of a restoration program led by the Monterey Bay Aquarium. This is a complicated graph. I don't want to go into too much detail, other than to say that what we've done here is to bring together in a benefit cost analysis all of the elements that we've talked about. We've talked about the effects on freight. We've talked about the effects on passenger transportation. We've looked at the costs of investing. But we've also looked at the losses in the value of ecosystem services and the losses or gains in the value of recreation services. So we looked at take no action, and essentially there is a $600 million loss, primarily because of large-scale safety losses, because we're moving on to 2-lane highways, which were never designed to have the kind of straight pattern that Highway 1 has. But big losses in recreation and big losses in ecosystem services provided by all of those habitats that would be lost. And then we compared that to the 2-lane and the 4-lane and the shift inland. Long story short, basically, if you solve the traffic problem by going to 4 lanes on Highway 1 and invest about $220 million on top of that in wetlands restoration and in the development of additional habitat connected to the roadway, those 4-lane options are the only ones that are positive economic return. And what we've been able to show here is by looking at the relationship between the ecological and the economic aspects of this sea level rise climate change problem together, we're able to show where the positive gains are for the system as a whole and for both the economic and ecological sides. Understanding these ecosystem services is a tricky matter from an economist's point of view, because many of them like the value of recreation, like the value of the habitat services provided by Elkhorn Slough. There's no price for those. Nobody's actually paying for those. It's true that some people do pay for a tour company to rent, or a rental company to rent them their kayaks. Those people I showed you a minute ago were probably in rental kayaks. But that you don't spend money just to rent a kayak. You spend money to gain an experience, and it's the value of that experience that isn't priced very well. And that's what we tried to measure in our study. So we look at a combination of the contributions to the production of marketed goods and services. We estimated the economic impacts from all of the hotel stays, all of the meals spent, all the meals bought by recreationists in Elkhorn Slough, as well as the businesses' values and the employment associated with all of that. In our study, measures those contributions to the production of marketed goods and services. We look at the value to users, because the value to the user is not the same thing as the price they pay. We look at avoided costs. So a lot of the costs, a lot of the benefits of doing something are avoiding the losses incurred from doing nothing. And there's also another set of school of economic thought that says we need to look at the value of wetlands and so on by asking, well, what would it cost to replace that? So we measure all those things in annual flows. And many of you may have heard the term natural capital. Natural capital, human capital, physical capital, those are the three capital stocks on which the economy depends. And natural capital is the flow of goods and services associated with the ecological values that we're trying to measure. I won't go into all of the details of how we do this non-market valuation. I will tell you that if we had not done the survey of recreational users, we would not have seen the value of recreation. And so there's a lot of very specific on-the-ground detailed research in different places in order to put all of that together. So what you need here is a system that's sort of generally depicted here, from conceptual models, land use types, ecosystem, habitat, salt marsh, open water, tidal flats are all examples of land use classifications. You need to have some idea of how those change. That's what we did with our model. We need to have some kind of indicators showing which are more important than others. For example, if we wanted to measure the value of blue carbon in Elkhorn Slough, we would be looking at certain types of salt marsh and not other types. We would then develop a set of empirical models and simulation models. And we did all of that for Elkhorn Slough, but that's just it's one small place in California. What we need to get to is what I call the digital ocean, which is basically the idea that we cannot fully understand these complex interactions between ecology and environment by observation. We have to do it in the computer. Just as today, if you read the newspaper about what's happening in the US economy, much of what you will read is about individual circumstances, businesses failing, or maybe some new businesses opening up. Right now, we're at that kind of individual level measurements. But if you want to understand what's happening in the economy as a whole, we need economy-wide data, which is only collectible and only understandable really in large-scale data systems and in large-scale computer models. And this is where I think the big part of the future of the blue economy lies, in establishing this concept of the digital ocean. We need to bring together ocean science with ocean economic development and a consistent set of measuring and monitoring in this digital ocean to see these interactions as they occur over time, and so that we can track the consequences of decisions that we make. We want to know that if, for example, we restore a wetland, or if we make a change in fishing practice, or if we put a port here rather than there, we want to be able to track over time not only the economic consequences, but the ecological consequences and the values as they would occur together. We've just yesterday put in a proposal along with our colleagues at Moss Landing Marine Labs to NOAA on developing a blue ocean accounting system for aquaculture in California, so that the complete ecological and economic picture of aquaculture in California can be monitored, can be defined, measured, and monitored over time. And that's what it's going to take to make this work. The third part, and I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes on this, is the blue tech stuff. This is a slightly different version of the colorized version of the graphic I had behind my bullseye graphic a little bit earlier. The ocean enterprise is an idea that's developed, and it represents the enterprise, or the sum total of all of the efforts that are going on around the world to apply technology in one way or another to the use, measurement, remediation, and prevention of harm to the ocean. Everything that we're going to have to do in order to not only just keep current levels of economic activity related to the ocean, but to expand that in the face of a changing ocean ecosystem from climate change, is going to require much more complex and innovative technologies than we are currently deploying, almost all of which were built for a relationship to the ocean that is 100 or more years old. The ocean enterprise is in the U.S. It's found around the world. This is just a map from a study a few years ago that we did a little bit of work with. It just shows you the centers of ocean enterprise or ocean blue technology innovation. You can see Los Angeles and San Diego. I mean, the really big ones are San Diego, Southern California, Seattle, and Eastern Massachusetts, along with Miami. Southern California is largely driven by the Scripps, Seattle, Washington by the University of Washington, and the Eastern Massachusetts by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Houston's big because of the concentration there of oil and gas related technologies. Miami is also big, and again, a major part of that is an academic institution, in that case, the Rosenstiel School. You'll notice Salinas is up there. Salinas has very little blue technology, but of course, MBARI and the Monterey Bay Aquarium do have, and the Hopkins Lab in Monterey. One of the major reasons why Salinas shows up there, it really shouldn't say Salinas, it should say Monterey, but I haven't been able to persuade them to change the map. So what do we need to do to understand the ocean as socio-ecological, or if you prefer, ecological social systems? We have four challenges. One is research. There's not nearly enough money going into this work right now in the U.S. We live sort of hand to mouth in our field. Education. We have to train a new generation of social scientists and of scientists to understand that they are operating in these coupled systems, not just in the one system that most interests them. Management. The blue economy will not occur merely because the president, obviously another one than the one we have, comes out and says the blue economy is a great thing. It will only happen because businesses and government agencies and stakeholder groups recognize these connections and work together to make the connections visible and useful. And finally, we need a lot of changes in policy. Right now, I would say that we are still stuck in a 1970s view of the world, in which the economy is one track, essentially that one ship sailing, and the ecology is sailing along beside it, with the people representing the ecology mostly consumed with firing shots across the bow, or occasionally trying to get a shot through the hull of the economy moving. So we're essentially still trying to battle between the economy and the ecology, rather than to see them as part of a convoy, all trying to go in the same direction with the same purpose. I have 4 rules. Break up the silos. Stop putting everybody into their own perspective, and break that up. Integration follows funding, not the other way around. Somebody has to kick up the money to make this happen. Sheer bureaucratic, organizational, political inertia will never create the blue economy until somebody comes along and puts up the money that says, don't stop doing it that way, start doing it this way. Adapt first, invent second. The first thing we've got to do is figure out where we are and how we can adapt to the current situation. And then we need to invent the technologies to deal with that. And finally, measure, monitor, repeat. Measure, monitor, repeat, et cetera, et cetera. I think that I can probably make up some more rules if necessary, but after a long time studying this, those are the ones that occur to me as the most useful ones right up front. So, can the blue economy be more than a slogan? That's the question I started out with. I still do not have an answer for it. I think a positive answer is possible, but by no means inevitable. I have to say that current conditions in the U.S. Probably are a setback, if only because the sheer volume of resources we need to fix our current problems is going to divert resources away from what will need to be spent and employed to make all of this happen. But it's not a done deal, nor is it a inevitable consequence of the current situation that nothing can or will be done. And there may be some opportunities to reorient things. I've been asked a lot of times, well, what are the economic consequences of where we are now? And the only thing that I am absolutely sure of is that the current situation will reinvent or reorder the spatial economy, our relationship between economic uses and the distribution of those uses over space. And that inevitably is going to affect the coast and is going to affect the oceans. I don't know how all of that's going to happen yet. Obviously, one of the ways it's happening is what we're doing right now. I'm not in Long Beach. I'm not standing in front of that podium. And wouldn't be normally in any circumstance, it wouldn't be in California this time anyway. But now we can go ahead and do it because we've reinvented our spatial relationships as a result of that. And it actually has turned out to be not as good in some ways, but better in others. So that's who we are, centerfortheblueeconomy.org. That's my email address if anybody has questions that we don't deal with this evening. Happy to have correspondence with people and happy to answer any questions about this. And in the meantime, I'll turn it back to Jerry.
Charlie, thank you very much. The COVID pandemic is going to leave a financial wake that's going to be very long-lasting and very significant. And so I agree with you that money is going to be hard to come by. On the other hand, if you look at the World Bank definition of the blue economy, sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods, and jobs while preserving the health of ocean ecosystems. If we could make the case that there's money to be made in the ocean, then maybe we could change this dynamic. And as you pointed out, though, around the world, virtually every maritime nation is talking about the blue economy, and many are doing something about it, except the U.S., and we seem to be sitting on the shore. Why do you think that is? What are the 2 or 3 reasons that the U.S. is not really engaged in the blue economy?
There really have only been 2 kind of major focuses on the oceans as a high-level policy issue. One in the late 1960s with the Stratton Commission, and one in the early 2000s with the National Ocean Commission and the Pew Ocean Commission. After each of those activities, there was some substantial activity. Obviously, after the Stratton Commission, we had the Coastal Zone Management Act and a number of other legislation. A number of other additional legislation was put in place. Not so much. Some of it was tweaked around the edges after the 2000 Oceans Commissions. In a way, I think that the problem has been in large part because the first steps, like coastal zone management, that was a big step, but it was a step off of nothing, and the ultimate shape of coastal management would not emerge for many years. The stuff that needs to be done now is harder, much more complex organizationally and politically. And, frankly, the American government just doesn't do complex things anymore. There are a whole variety of reasons for that, some political, some organizational, some dealing with the way in which the economy has evolved, but we just don't do big things anymore. And so when a big idea like this comes along, it gets the due attention of an occasional study commission and maybe some nice words from some political leader somewhere. But in terms of really shifting around resources, we just don't do that anymore on anything. And so the kind of stasis in American policymaking, which affects so many different areas, simply catches up the blue economy in its tidal weight.
And somehow we've got to overcome that. John Kingdon, who used to be on the faculty at the University of Michigan, said, "Nothing happens unless it's on the agenda." And he meant by that, if it's not on the list of things that legislators and the executive branch are paying attention to, nothing happens. The ocean hasn't been on the agenda for a long, long time. And you can look at, I did once, I analyzed all the State of the Union addresses going back through five or six presidents, and the ocean, it's not mentioned. Space is mentioned prominently in most State of the Union addresses. Somehow we've got to get it on there. So in the U.S. economy, tourism, oil and gas, and transportation, those are the big three, right?
Those are the big three, private sector plus the Navy. I mean, it's one of the things that I think is going to be interesting when these new ocean statistics get widely disseminated, is to see how much investment the U.S. government has in the oceans, and most of it's in the military.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are going to look at that and say, wait a minute, is this all we can do with the oceans, is spend money on the Navy?
And it's a Navy that really is not in tune with the 21st century either. But anyway, tourism, oil, and transportation are the big three in the private sector, right?
Yes.
And if you look to the end of the century with sea level rise, and we're going to see tourism is going to be compromised by sea level rise because most of it's coastal tourism, beach dependent. That's going to change. Oil and gas, we in the United States won't be probably recovering any oil and gas after another 10 or 15 years. Transportation will remain strong. But does that bother you in terms of if we don't do something?
Well, we will evolve. I mean, the old saying that unsustainable trends won't last. And I think I do think that's true. We will evolve in a lot of ways. One of the things we're learning from doing our sea level rise work, and we're also doing work in Santa Cruz and here in Maine. We're kind of planning for worst case scenarios. And one of the things we're learning is that there's going to be an awful lot of money that's going to have to be spent to adapt to sea level rise, and it would almost certainly be hugely cheaper not to have to adapt to sea level rise than getting climate change under control. And that's one of the message I keep trying to get across to people is I know how much we're trying to spend, we'll have to spend on adaptation, and I want to spend what we have to spend as wisely as possible. But really, folks, it's a lot cheaper not to have to do this at all. And that's an unfortunate message that still hasn't gotten through somehow, that it's like we're back at the beginning of the 19th century and our wars with the Barbary pirates, when we said millions for defense and not 1 cent for tribute. Well, we're millions for tribute in the form of adaptation and not 1 cent for defense in the form of climate mitigation. And it's kind of odd.
But on the other hand, we must mitigate climate change. Still, a lot of the effects of sea level rise are baked in if we went to zero emissions.
A certain amount of effects are baked in. The worst the worst effects do not have to happen, however.
That's right. They do not have to happen, but we have to plan for probably a meter or more. So how does the Coastal Commission, the California Coastal Commission, react to your Elkhorn Slough study? You're engineering nature.
Yeah, but I mean,
No, Charlie, nobody's listening. You can tell me.
Where in California have we not engineered nature?
Well, that's true. Absolutely true.
I mean, California is an entirely engineered society.
Yes, it is. And we're going to have to continue to engineer it.
Yeah. And so, we had a lot of detailed comments from the Coastal Commission staff on the Elkhorn Slough study. I think they had a lot of trouble coming to grips with the economics of what we were trying to do. I think that the staff has kept trying to push for, planning for more and more sea level rise, higher and higher sea level rise. So that just means more and more expensive, responses. And one of the things I've kept trying to point out in using the economics with respect to sea level rise is, look, there's not enough money to adapt to sea level rise in California or anywhere else. Right. There just isn't to preserve everything that's there if you talk about through 2 or 3 meters of sea level rise. So we'd better use what we have as wisely as possible. And I think that's the blue economy perspective on this, that resources, ecological systems, economic systems are not capable of infinite use. And the need, therefore, is to very tightly understand the relationship between these two types of systems so that we can make the best use of what resources we have. The Coastal Commission, quite honestly, their perspective on the Elkhorn Slough study was that they didn't want to see a 4-lane highway built. They didn't want to see 2 additional lanes. They regarded that as unacceptable from the point of view of the Coastal Act. That was the staff point of view. I don't know what a commission in 2035 will ever say about that. The Coastal Commission has approved highway expansions in other places. Right.
So, Charlie,
that was their big concern.
Let me change the subject to aquaculture for a second. You live part of the time in Maine, which has embraced aquaculture. It's one of the leading states in the nation for aquaculture of shellfish, finfish, algae in the water and on land. You spend much of your time in California. We're one of the real laggards in aquaculture. We haven't issued a new shellfish permit in the coastal zone for more than 20 years. We've never issued a permit for a finfish farm. What's the difference between you maniacs and those of us who live in California?
Well, that's too broad a question to answer.
No, you know both of us. Now, it's interesting when I have a daughter who lives in Maine, works for Audubon, and she tells me that the people who live in Maine year-round, they refer to the people who come for vacations as, they say, some of them are people and some aren't.
Yep.
But what's the difference between us?
Well, I think the legal regime has a lot to do with it. In Maine, beginning in the 1970s, we go back with aquaculture. The first aquaculture operation in Maine was in 1975. A guy named Ed Myers hung some mussels on a rope down in the town of Walpole. He called it Abandoned Farms. And nobody knew what to do with it, but the state looked at it and said, well, don't have any specific law against it, so just go ahead and do it. The only thing they required was a lease of submerged lands, because the Maine, like California, owns the submerged lands. And in Maine, the submerged lands are entirely owned by the state. There is no alienation of the lands to local governments. It's all owned by the state. Right. And so there is a one-stop shop in the Bureau of Public Lands to get a lease for submerged lands. In California, it can be more complicated because of the local alienation of some of the rights of submerged lands. I'm not sure that I have a complete answer to that, because I've never been through the aquaculture process. But I do think that there is a general sense in California that the Coastal Act was set up to preserve the coast the way it is. And I should say that I was at one time, I was not only involved in the creation of the Maine Coastal Program, I was its director for several years. And we never took the position that the Maine Coastal Program and the acts underlying it, we don't have a single act. We're there to preserve the coast as it existed then. We viewed the coastal management as a process by which the essential nature of the coast was preserved while people continued to use it. My observation in California is that there's a tendency. The first reaction is any change along the shore, any change in the coastal zone shouldn't take place. Right. And that's probably an unfair observation, because I haven't been involved in coastal management in California, except peripherally many years ago, back in the 80s. But that's what I see going on now. Is that the right interpretation of the Coastal Act or not? I don't know. But I think that I find it frustrating that as somebody who looks at the shoreline, this is Monterey Bay, looks at this and says, look, this is all underwater in 50 or 100 years. And, so the thing that we need to do, first of all, is preserve that landscape, preserve those beaches. Well, I don't know how you're going to do it without enormous expenditures that we don't really have the money for. And so right. I think it is a difficult thing. I do think that sea level rise and climate change are going to force Californians to think about what they want out of the shoreline and the coast in different ways than they have done in the past. And in my own view, they probably should go back to the Coastal Act and ask what are the essential parts of this that need to stay, and what are the parts that need to change in a world in which the coast is no longer a stable entity, but itself is undergoing rapid change.
And I think that's a good point, because we not only live in a world of rapid change, but the leading edge of much of that change is taking place along our coastlines. One last question. I'm going to make you the czar of the blue economy for the United States. You have unlimited powers, and your challenge is the one that the administrator of NOAA has given. He wants to double the U.S. blue economy within a decade. I'd like you to tell us, what are the 3 to 5 things you would do to significantly increase the blue economy, say in the next decade, but to where should we invest to increase it significantly by 2050? What are the 3 to 5 things you would do as czar?
Well, I think we can all be grateful that, in fact, that will never happen.
It might be an interesting experiment, Charlie.
I do think there are clearly some areas. One is sea level rise adaptation. When we've studied sea level rise adaptation, one of the things that we have emphasized, particularly with respect to finance, is you're already adapting to sea level rise. You just don't know it yet, because you're making hundreds of decisions about transportation and community investments. So a lot of, if we take a climate stable or climate adapted shoreline or climate adaptive coast as an outcome of the blue economy. There are tons of opportunities to harness existing investment streams and existing expenditure streams to make that happen and achieve a lot of other objectives at the same time. So that's one place I'd be looking. Another place I'd be looking is I think that there is a huge amount of potential from, and again, I'm going to kind of focus the moment on the ecological side. There's a huge amount of potential still on wetlands restoration, which we have included in our ocean economy statistics for the first time. So you see in that construction area, in that coastal construction, we could easily expand the construction industry in the U.S. In the coastal areas or ocean-related areas with a lot more investment in restoration, which would get a lot of benefits. I think fisheries management is one of the big challenges because the climate change is going to shift fisheries. I'd go back in and look at the ways in which there are opportunities created by climate change and challenges. If you want to double the ocean economy, one of the first things you better do is keep it from shrinking too much. And that's going to be a real challenge in the fisheries. I would invest a lot more. There are a lot of technologies, and this digital ocean idea brings together our existing strengths in information and communications technologies, our strengths in oceanography, and in economic development. And there's an awful lot that can be done, I think, to leverage our existing strengths in those areas into not only new industries, but perhaps whole new sectors of economic activity that we're not even measuring yet. And finally, I'll pick the one obvious one, which is renewable energies, primarily wind. The potential there is simply enormous. It's unbelievable how slow we have been to adapt to it. Maine has enough physically measured wind potential to power virtually all of New England. And the fact that we've got this one tiny little operation off of Block Island is the only thing we've managed to accomplish in 10 or 15 years is quite remarkable. And is another example of what I mean by we just don't do big things anymore.
Well, if I let you add another one, would you put aquaculture on your list? I'm disappointed, Charlie.
So aquaculture, I think, has a lot of potential. I tend to agree with you that offshore aquaculture is probably where a lot of it's going to have to be. And incidentally, I should say that here in Maine, we do have a lot of aquaculture. A lot of it, however, has been bitterly fought over site by site. There's still a massive fight going on just east of here in the town of Brunswick in Macquarie Bay over a 6 or 7 acre oyster farm. So we have fought it every step of the way. Locals have the NIMBY factor here has been just as strong as anywhere. I didn't want to let us get off the hook on that. But I do think aquaculture is a part of it. But I have to say, in terms of doubling the economy, I don't think so. I think it will make an important contribution, but I'm not sure we can get to that scale that fast in aquaculture unless we can find some extremely valuable products that have really, really high value and steady demand.
And Charlie, I would agree with you. There's a wonderful little book called Experiments in Ethics, and one of the statements the author makes is, the challenge in life is not so much about learning how to play the game as it is learning what game to play. I think the U.S., founded as a maritime nation, needs to look back at its history and begin again to play in this very important game. Charlie, thank you very much for an exciting and inspiring lecture. Stay safe, and we hope that you'll be coming back to California sometime soon. Good night, everyone. Join us next week, and we're going to have an amazing underwater photographer, diver, who's going to share some of his photos with us. We hope we'll see you then. Good night, everyone.